It's time for the week 6 waiver wire ads and also players you can drop. Dave Kluge, we're going to be going through a bunch of players today. And for the waiver wire ads, we're going to be looking at players that are available in at least 60% of leagues or more. It's getting to the point here where I don't think we're casting as wide of a net in terms of waiver wire. There's not as many good players out there on waivers. You end up having a lot more teams on bye, players that are just getting injured. So without any further ado, let's jump into it. Dave, get us started with the running backs.
Roschon Johnson. I mean, I had conceded just 2 weeks ago that this was now Khalil Herbert's backfield. I mean, he completely took over in week 4, but now he is expected to miss multiple weeks, is the report, with what I believe they're saying is a high ankle sprain, some sort of ankle sprain. I mean, his whole leg, foot, ankle, everything got twisted up in a really
My
weird play,
heart,
but
my heart got twisted up, Dave.
yeah. He'll be back at some point, and I think that he has kind of taken over the RB1 role here in Chicago, but Roschon Johnson is next up. He is on deck, and he should get some work. Now, Roschon Johnson also is dealing with an injury himself. He got knocked out of the game with a concussion, but he's got 10 full days before he has a chance to play again, with them playing on Thursday night. So hopefully he is able to clear concussion protocol before then. I like Roschon. I've talked about him a lot this offseason. Early in the season, he's got the size to be a 3-down back. He is a tackle breaking and pass catching machine, the things we want to see from a running back. So yeah, Roschon Johnson is a guy that, if you're hurting at running back, we could be looking at potentially 3, 4, 5 weeks maybe of a guy who is going to be giving us middling to high end RB2 upside. So if you're hurting for a running back, this is a guy I'm okay dropping 20 to 30% of your fab on.
And how do you feel about his counterpart there in the backfield in Chicago, Deontay Foreman? I know you're a Bears fan. You're very well versed with this team. Is this a guy that fantasy managers should be worried about us putting any type of fab on?
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's been really weird. I've been a big Deontay Foreman fan since he came into the league. Former third-round pick, blew his Achilles out early in his career and kind of struggled to get up to speed. But for the last few years, every time he's had an opportunity, he's done really well with it. I mean, if you look out of the last 17 games that he has played a full-time role, whether it was in Carolina or in Tennessee, he's rushed for 100-plus yards in 8 of those 17 games. We've also seen him play 2 very different roles. When he was in Tennessee, he was catching a ton of passes, showing that he has that ability. When he was in Carolina, he was just kind of this between the tackles hammer. He's a really good running back. I mean, he has prototypical speed, all the size and speed, the things you want to see from a running back.
Right.
So yeah, I'm okay dropping a little bit of money on him. It's been weird though, because he's been a healthy scratch for almost this entire season so far. We thought he was going to be a bigger part of the game plan, looked good in the preseason, but hopefully now, I think with this situation, basically what they do is rather than having to go out and bring in a Leonard Fournette or a Mike Boone or somebody like that, they've got Deontay Foreman kind of looming in the shadows so they could elevate him. But I still think Roschon Johnson is going to be the guy ahead of Deontay Foreman. But if Roschon can't clear concussion protocol, we're looking at a 1-week spot start here from Deontay Foreman, which could be kind of valuable.
Yeah, if I have to pick one of the two, I'm probably going to lean towards Roschon Johnson. But you're absolutely right. It's going to be kind of a wait and see approach with the medical stuff. And I'm going to talk about another guy who could get some more opportunity due to injury in the backfield, and it's Jeff Wilson, running back for the Miami Dolphins. And he's kind of turned into an afterthought because of how good this running back room has been. Devon Achane and Raheem Mostert have been absolutely fantastic. Devon Achane is, I believe, second in the league in rushing yards right now, despite really only playing like 3 full games. It's insane. But he does leave week 5 with what appears to be some sort of an ankle sprain. We haven't heard too much more on it. The beat writers in Miami have not really talked about it too much, but there's video evidence of him sustaining the injury, leaving the field. So Jeff Wilson is more of a speculative ad. He's available in 70% of leagues, and we're seeing Miami's leading the league in rushing yards, 109 more rushing yards than the second best team in the league right now, the Philadelphia Eagles. And Miami's got 24 total touchdowns on the season, which is the most in the league. It's 5 more than the second best teams, Detroit and Buffalo. So I just want a running back, if he's available, that's part of this offense, which is why if he's there on the waiver wire and I have Devon Achane, I'm willing to go look at Jeff Wilson here.
And
Dave,
I'll
why
just
don't you
say
take us
Jeff
to our
Wilson,
next guy? Yeah.
he's a very different type of running back than
Yes.
Mostert and A-Chain. You know,
Yes.
these are the speedsters that you're hoping can score from 50, 70, 80 yards out, and they're going to consistently do that. But I think once Wilson is back in the mix, anytime they're near the goal line, I think most of those touches are probably going Wilson's way. So for a high-flying team that scores a lot and gets in the red zone often, Jeff Wilson Jr., even if Achan and Mostert are both healthy, you could have some kind of nice standalone value there. But I'll talk about Justice Hill next. Snip, snap, snip, snap, snip, snap. I mean, just a couple weeks ago, we were saying to pick up Justice Hill. Then we were saying Gus Edwards. Last week, we talked about Keaton Mitchell. I got to be honest. I'm not too happy about the way this backfield is shaking out. And if you just want to completely avoid it, I don't blame you whatsoever. But a week removed from the injury, you know, last week we saw him in a very limited role as he was coming back from that foot toe injury. But last week he saw 100% of the running back targets and ripped off a decent chunk play for a touchdown. So I'm not saying to go spend everything you've got on Justice Hill and put him in your starting lineup, but he's worth a stash for now. You know, he's got a lot of speed, fits well with this offense. I still think Gus Edwards is going to be a part of the backfield, whether we like it or not, but Justice Hill is worth a stash for now.
That Ravens backfield, really, really annoying at this point. Let's talk about another guy that is slowly becoming, I mean, an even bigger part of this offense. And at this point, I don't even know that he should be available in this many leagues. It's Tyjae Spears, running back for the Tennessee Titans. He's available in 75% of leagues. And we saw this in these past 3 games. He has played 50% or more of snaps in the last 3 games. And you looking at a stat from Jacob Gibbs over at CBS Sportsline, Tyjae Spears outsnapped Derrick Henry in 3 of 5 games and has outscored him in 2 of 5 games this season. Tyjae Spears is doing a lot better than we think, and I don't think we're quite looking at the opportunity that he's getting. 12 opportunities in this past game to Derrick Henry's 15. Opportunities are targets and carries combined. So Tyjae Spears is becoming a big part of the offense. The Titans simply just don't have weapons on that team outside of DeAndre Hopkins and Derrick Henry. Right now, Spears is tied for 3rd on the team in targets. So I think he's a guy that's not only going to get that work in the passing game like we're already seeing, but he's starting to get more and more work in that rushing game as well. Now, before we move on here, if you're enjoying this video, please take a moment to like this video, click that thumbs up, make sure you're subscribed to the channel because we're bringing you this show every Monday through Thursday. On top of that, we've got a bunch of other shows, The Audible, On the Couch, the Football Guys Dynasty Show, and then every Sunday morning, we have a live start-sit Q&A for you, the subscribers. And if you have any questions about your waiver wires or trade questions, anything like that here for Week 6, drop that in the comments down below. Dave, why don't you take us to our next guy here, Chuba Hubbard.
Yeah, he outtouched Miles Sanders for the 2nd consecutive week, and Sanders is obviously dealing with a groin injury. He doesn't look like himself at all, but this is becoming much more of a committee than I think we had expected. You know, in the offseason, we were following the money, and Deuce Staley had the connection with Miles Sanders, and we thought that he was going to be a workhorse on this big contract, but Sanders just hasn't looked all that great. And yeah, of course, you can chalk some of that up to the injury, but Carolina has shown that they are willing to trust Chuba Hubbard with a decent role in this offense. So at best, you know, he's got some standalone value here and sort of a 50-50 timeshare. And at worst, if Sanders has to miss any time, I think that Carolina has shown that they will just lean on Chuba when they need to. Talked about this briefly last week with Joey Wright. Chuba, his rookie season was really disappointing, and I think that some people have kind of struggled to get that distaste out of their mouth after such a bad rookie season and high expectations, but he's developed into a pretty good running back since then. So, like I said, at best, a little bit of standalone value perhaps, but at worst, he makes for a pretty high-end handcuff.
And I've got another guy here who's looking like a relatively high-end handcuff, and it's Kendre Miller, running back for the New Orleans Saints. He's available in 93% of leagues. And I mean, at the very least, if you have Alvin Kamara, you should consider rostering Kendre Miller. We saw this past week career highs in rushing and receiving yards, 15 touches on 26 snaps. Now, I will say this, there's the caveat. A lot of that happened in the 4th quarter. A lot of that happened towards the end of the game when it was just wildly out of reach. So this is still very much Alvin Kamara's backfield. Don't get it twisted. But we see this all the time with rookie running backs. As the year goes on, Kendre Miller will likely start to get a little bit more work, especially if we see any type of slowdown from Alvin Kamara or this Saints team. They're going to look for a spark elsewhere. We saw he's a very capable receiver, despite not having those receiving numbers from college. So Kendre Miller is a guy that if anything were to happen to Alvin Kamara, he can handle a full workload. Dave, why don't you take us over to our next guy here? And we're confirming he is a real player. He's a real person. Ronnie Rivers, running back for the Los Angeles Rams.
Now, I know I'm making some people upset with this take here, that I continue beating this anti-Kendre Williams drum, but he has been very bad. Do not let the fantasy production lead you astray and think that he's a good running back. He has not been. I mean, once again, in week 5, he was dead last in rushing yards over expectation per attempt. That is the third time in the last 4 weeks that he has been the worst running back in the NFL. To try to contextualize this, some of the other guys that are floating around that area for efficiency are A.J. Dillon, Jamal Williams, Clyde Edwards-Helaire. So it's like you're like expecting Kendre Williams to maintain his role would be like expecting one of these guys to take over their respective backfields. He has been an actual liability on the field for the Los Angeles Rams. And it's not just me. You can hear a lot of other fantasy analysts saying the same thing. He's just been bad. And right now, Ronnie Rivers is averaging 1.5 extra yards per carry. So maybe Rivers takes over. Maybe Royce Freeman gets in the mix a little bit. Maybe Zach Evans finally gets the opportunity he wanted to see. Maybe they bring in Leonard Fournette. But what I'm trying to do is get ahead of the inevitable. I don't expect Kendre Williams to maintain what he's been doing, and somebody else is going to be a part of this very good Los Angeles Rams offense. The only running back right now who has left more yards on the field than Kendre Williams is Ramondre Stevenson. This team has been in a lot of close games that they have lost. They're going to have to change something with this backfield. So get ahead of it right now. Stash Ronnie Rivers, stash Zach Evans, maybe pick up Leonard Fournette, but try to get ahead of what's going to happen in this Los Angeles Rams backfield.
And you know what's funny is you mentioned Kendre Williams and the similarities there to Clyde Edwards-Helaire from last year. And we saw early on in the season, CEH had the touchdown production, and that wasn't quite so sticky as the year went on. And then there was plenty of fantasy managers that got caught holding the bag, thinking, okay, Clyde Edwards-Helaire is going to keep doing this, right? Because it's a good offense, right? That's how this works. No. And then we eventually see you get the Isaiah Pacheco's and the Jerick McKinnon's coming out, and that's what we could see. Listen, we're not saying Ronnie Rivers is this absolutely must-go grab player with 1 carry in last week's game, but there could be opportunities for other running backs coming up really soon.
I actually like Zach Evans as a stash more. I mean, he's been struggling with pass pro, and that's why we haven't seen him active on game day, but he has the build to be a 3-down back, and we've seen Sean McVay, just like that, will switch his favor and give the workload to a new running back. And I think Zach Evans is actually the guy. Obviously, we want to see him activated before we get too excited about it, but he was active last week, didn't get any touches, but I think that we're going to see Zach Evans become a part of this backfield sooner rather than later.
I don't know. I'm not a big fan of his, but I get it. I do. Let's take a look at the final running back we're talking about here today, and it's Emari Demercado. Dave, did you know that Emari Demercado's last name directly translates to Amari of the market in English? Did you know that?
I did not.
You're welcome. Spanish lesson for the day. But Emari Demercado, the running back for the Arizona Cardinals, he's available in 99% of leagues. And I'm just going to venture that roughly 99% of fantasy managers had no idea who he was until this last week. But now we're seeing James Conner leave the game with a knee injury. He has a history of knee injuries. He could miss 1 to 2 weeks. Talked about it with Dr. David Chow last night. You can go check that out over on the podcast feed where we recap all the injury action from week 5. But listen, Emari Demercado, he got 100% of the work when James Conner went out. 10 carries, 45 yards, and a touchdown, 3 targets. And that's actually what he was doing when he was at TCU. He was a receiving back with Kendre Miller, and he was holding off Kendre Miller, a very highly touted prospect, from getting the receiving work at TCU. Now, he's also sharing a backfield there with Corey Clement. He's been a practice squad guy, and we really haven't seen much from him. And there was a lot of high hopes for Keontae Ingram, who's the other running back on this team, but he's been dealing with an injury, and even when he's been out there, he has not been good. 12 carries for 15 yards. He's averaging just barely over a yard per carry. So Emari Demercado, he's the guy that I would be looking at to roster from this Arizona Cardinals backfield if James Conner is to miss any time. Now, let's hop into the wide receivers here. And this was kind of a late ad because we didn't see this injury until a bit later. But KJ Osborn, wide receiver for the Minnesota Vikings. He's available in 78% of leagues. And Justin Jefferson looks like he may have gotten a hamstring injury. I know that today the reports are that there are tests being done. It could be nothing, but even if he misses just 1 week, KJ Osborn, for me, is a guy who is very much like Joshua Palmer, who we've touted in weeks past. Is a wide receiver handcuff. You want him out there because the team is going to pass a ton. Listen, KJ Osborn this past week, most snaps of any wide receiver on the team, tied for first in the team in targets with TJ Hawkinson. And they've got a really good matchup, Dave. I'm sorry, versus the Chicago Bears in week 6. And if the Bears can continue to keep their offense rolling, their secondary allowing passing yards as they have, this could be actually end up being quite the shootout here in week 6 for the Vikings and Bears. So KJ Osborn, if Justin Jefferson is to miss any time, and even if he doesn't, it's still just a good player to have on your roster, sort of that wide receiver handcuff, so to speak.
I mean, he had a wide open touchdown yesterday that I'm sure you saw. Like, he got confused that the ball came his way and he ducked instead of going up for the touchdown. I don't know if you saw that one, but the opportunities have been there. KJ Osborn is a very good receiver. And yeah, if Jefferson has to miss some time, definitely somebody that I'd be looking at. I'll talk about Rashee Rice here, still available in almost 80% of leagues. And he had 5 targets yesterday, which was the second on the team behind only Travis Kelce. Again, this kind of feels like the Ravens backfield, where we keep talking about different guys almost every single week, but Rashee Rice is kind of the unknown, the mystery box. We don't know what he could be, but he has had 2 touchdowns this year in just 5 games, and there's reason to believe that role could be expanded a little bit. It seems like Patrick Mahomes likes to look at him when they get near the end zone. And now, with Travis Kelce, he was able to come back in the game, but we've seen stuff like this before where somebody tweaks an ankle, comes back into the game, and then the day after that ankle stiffens up a little bit. They've got a quick turnaround with having to play on Thursday night, and they could be without Travis Kelce. Now, I'm not a doctor. I'm not going to say how this is going to play out. I mean, Travis Kelce might be out there on Thursday night. He might miss a couple of weeks. We don't know, but targets are going to have to go somewhere, and Rashee Rice has looked pretty good. So if you're desperate right now and you need to pick somebody up, this team is desperate for a wide receiver 1, and Rice, the young guy, could end up stepping into that role.
You know what, Dave? And I don't even think it's really that desperate of a play to go and add Rashee Rice. I want to read off some of the numbers here for you because I wasn't a big Rashee Rice guy coming out of college, and so far it's actually been pretty good. You just can't argue with this. He's had 5 or more targets in 4 of his 5 career games. Mm-hmm. Now, the downside is so far he's been 5th in snaps and routes run. However, looking at this last game, 50% target per route run rate. First on the team. When he's out there on the field, he's getting targeted. And it's actually his 4th week in a row that he has led or tied for the league and lead in targets per route run amongst the wide receivers on the team. So there's a very specific usage for Rashee Rice amongst the wide receivers out there. I know that there's guys like Justin Watson and Sky Moore and Marquez Valdes-Scantling who are getting more playing time, but they're not getting targeted the same way. And we've seen this with rookies. The more playing time he gets, if he's getting targeted like this now, if that playing time goes up, the snap count goes up, you're talking about a guy who all of a sudden becomes fantasy viable. And I don't think a lot of people are actually going to be talking about him this week in terms of the waiver wire.
Yeah.
Now let's move on to another one I've got here. And I guess I'll just keep banging the drum for this until it just goes away. But Jameson Williams, he's still available in 60% of leagues. And don't freak out. Don't panic. I know it doesn't look great, but we knew that the Detroit Lions were going to be easing him back into action here. Okay. Not great. 2 receptions on 3 targets for just 2 yards. And everyone is going to take a look at the 1 drop he had on that 3rd target. But we know Lions are easing him back in. He actually had more snaps this past game than any game in the previous season, which I know it's still not much for him to be at a 47% snap share, but this is a guy who's getting back into it. Jared Goff had a very efficient game, 20 of 28 for 3 touchdowns. Lions were up by 18 at the start of the 4th quarter. So really, there was no reason to keep passing the ball. It was a very different Lions team than what we've seen. No Amon-Ra St. Brown, no Jahmyr Gibbs, and Sam Laporta went out there, just absolutely crushed it with 2 touchdowns. So we should see a bit more passing work going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers next week. And then after that, next 3 games, Las Vegas Raiders, Los Angeles Chargers, Chicago Bears. There is a lot of room for growth here for the Detroit Lions passing attack, and specifically Jameson Williams. Now, Dave, why don't you send us on over to our next guy, Curtis Samuel, wide receiver for the Washington Commanders.
Yeah, and we're getting into your deeper leagues here. This guy's still available in over 85% of leagues. So You're not picking him up, in your 10-team leagues with short benches or anything like that, but kind of a weird development that we're seeing here in Washington on a team with Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson, two wide receivers that everybody really liked in the preseason. He led the wide receiver room in targets, and he's had 15 targets now over the last 2 weeks. Now, somehow Logan Thomas has become like the de facto wide receiver one in this offense. I don't know what's happening. It is really hard to get a good solid read on what's happening in this Washington offense. But Curtis Samuel has had touchdowns now in back-to-back weeks, including a jet sweep in week 4. They're indicating a willingness to try to get the ball in his hands. And Curtis Samuel has always been a very good ball carrier. I kind of joke around. We always talk about the Deebo Samuel role. Well, Curtis Samuel was kind of playing that role before Deebo Samuel ever was. And he's getting used very creatively right now by Eric Bieniemy. So I don't expect this to maintain. I'm not saying that Curtis Samuel is the wide receiver one ahead of Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson, but we can't ignore the usage right now. They're getting the ball in his hands creatively as possible. So pick him up in your deep leagues, stash him. I think he'd probably need an injury to either Dotson or McLaurin to really be comfortable going into your lineup, but we can't ignore the usage right now. So pick him up, stash him, and see what happens.
Yeah, that's the good context that you add there, right? It's for the deeper leagues. He's not the new wide receiver one for this team, but it's just so hard to ignore usage. And I think there's going to be a lot of gun shy fantasy managers because we kind of fell into this trap last year with all the touchdown production from Curtis Samuel, and then it was just poof, gone. So I get it if there's some trepidation there. Now, next guy I want to talk about is wide receiver Josh Downs for the Indianapolis Colts, and he's still available in 89% of leagues. And this is the guy I think that, in like we talked about, in those deeper leagues, I think he needs to be rostered regardless of what you think of Gardner Minshew, Anthony Richardson, Michael Pittman. He's sort of becoming the wide receiver 2 on this team, and the Colts have been a lot better than we actually thought. Now with the return of Jonathan Taylor, and they obviously have their Pro Bowl running back, Zach Moss, who's just been absolutely fantastic. That's so annoying, man. I can't believe that's going on. But Josh Downs, he's been pretty good with Gardner Minshew. He was okay with Anthony Richardson, but he's done pretty well with Gardner Minshew. At least 6 receptions and 55 yards in both contests with Gardner Minshew at the helm at quarterback. He was a wide receiver 37 and wide receiver 17 with Minshew under center. Next game, they're going up against Jacksonville. By the way, I love that. Gardner Minshew starting against the Jacksonville Jaguars in a major revenge game narrative. That could be a lot of fun. And this could also be a game that requires a bit more passing, especially with Trevor Lawrence and that Jags offense looking a bit better. So yeah, I really like Josh Downs as a speculative ad in more of your deeper leagues, where you're starting 3 wide receivers and multiple flexes, stuff like that. All right, Dave, finish us off here with the wide receivers, taking a look at Jonathan Mingo, wide receiver for the Carolina Panthers.
And again, we're in the deep leagues now. But Jonathan Mingo has 21 targets over his last 3 games. It seems like he has kind of established his role as the wide receiver 2 behind Adam Thielen, which Adam Thielen, who expected this? I mean, just like 12 to 15 targets.
Not us, am I right?
Good for him. Yeah, way to go, Adam Thielen. Proud of you, buddy. But we know that it takes some time for rookie wide receivers to warm up, and it seems like Mingo is starting to warm up a little bit. First few games, he was just kind of getting these like short, easy dump offs, just kind of getting the ball in his hands. And over the last week, we've seen his yards per catch and yards per target nearly double, which, he started to get some bigger plays here, which is what we had hoped to see. Jonathan Mingo was kind of surprising for people who aren't like super plugged in during the draft. A lot of people were looking at him as like a 4th, 5th round guy with some upside. And then Carolina kind of surprised everybody by taking him early in round 2. But you can't really ignore the measurables and the athleticism. I mean, this guy's just like an athletic freak. He's kind of the same archetype as somebody like an A.J. Brown or a DK Metcalf. He can kind of do things after the catch like Deebo Samuel. I'm not saying that he is that good, but when you look at his measurables, his size, his college production, his draft capital, he does kind of fit in with a lot of those guys. He's big, strong, physical, fast. He can make contested catches, get yards after the catch. So Thielen has been old reliable here. We know that, but this team needs a true alpha, and Mingo can step up to be that alpha in this in this offense. So yeah, getting really emotional about Jonathan Mingo here. So I mean, he's a stash at this point, but Mingo does have a really, really high ceiling, and we see these rookies kind of come on later in the year. So yeah, I'm A-okay stashing Mingo for now.
Yeah, I remember comping Jonathan Mingo very similarly to Laviska Shenault, who's of course also on this team, and that's kind of the role that Jonathan Mingo had early. It's just the same thing that Shenault was doing. But we saw as a rookie, Shenault was actually able to go out and produce, and it didn't turn into anything career-wise down the line. But Jonathan Mingo, with first of all, better quarterback, better surrounding system there, a better infrastructure there in Carolina, it could become something. And you're right. When we get to these deeper waiver ads, we just can't ignore the usage.
Speaking
Now,
of,
before
Chenault
we move on,
looked pretty good yesterday with his
no,
touches.
stop.
He did. He's one of those guys
Okay.
that is always so limited. I was such a big fan of his coming out of college, and we just obviously we're probably never going to see it happen in the NFL at this point. But I just want to see him unleashed for like 1 week. Just give Shenault 15 touches and see what happens.
Let him become Cordero Patterson. Yes. Let it happen.
Year 9 breakout. It's coming.
There are literally dozens of us waiting for this. All right, before we move on, I want to remind you guys that we have got our custom weekly rankings and weekly waiver wire suggestions for you over on footballguys.com. You can check out the rankings. It's got myself and Dave and various other analysts there. You can check out the waiver wire article by Sigmund Bloom every single week over on footballguys.com. And well, all you have to do is become a pro subscriber. It's just $3.99 a month. It's the most affordable subscription in all of fantasy football. You can click the link down below or head on over to footballguys.com today. Now, Dave, we're going to do something a little different. We have not done this yet this year. Normally, we just throw out like 30 plus waiver wire ads because, there's just tons of players and various types of leagues and depths and whatnot. But we've gotten to the point where you're being a little bit more cautious with your waiver wire ads. There's not as many good players out there to pick up, but you also need to start clearing space on your team and on your bench. Maybe for players coming back off IR or just guys who you need to cut the cord on, guys you need to move on from. So why don't you get us started? We're going to take a look at 8 players that we are ready to drop from our roster. Why don't you start us off here?
Daniel Jones is a guy that we looked at as, having a sky-high ceiling, year 2 in Brian Daboll's offense, having Darren Waller as his reliable safety blanket, rushing upside. You heard it all in the offseason. A lot of people were pretty excited about Daniel Jones, but outside of his one game where he boomed 31.7 points, the 3rd highest score that any quarterback has logged in fantasy football this year. Outside of that outing, if you look at the average over his other 4 outings, he's the QB 35. He hasn't looked good. I mean, I'd say that he's looked
How many starting quarterbacks are there in the NFL?
Exactly. There are 32 teams, and he's giving you QB 35 production. It's not good. And yeah, his O-line has been awful. Weapons aren't great, but I plan to talk about Daniel Jones before the news came out this morning about his neck injury, so he might even miss some time, which makes him a really, really easy cut. But with guys like Brock Purdy and CJ Stroud and Jordan Love and other reliable quarterbacks popping up on the waiver wire, there's just no point to really roster Daniel Jones at this point. You can keep him stashed in your 2 quarterback and super flex leagues, but I don't even know if he's kind of in the streaming discussion at this point. Like, yeah, you might get that 32-point boom, but you could also get a 3, 4, 5-point outing. So I think it's safe to cut the cord on Daniel Jones.
Yeah, I'm ready to drop Dalvin Cook, running back for the New York Jets. It's weird to say that, especially because he was just this highly valued free agent going into this offseason, and everyone wanted him to be a running back on their team. And Dalvin Cook has just 19 PPR points across 5 games. 19 points, 5 games.
Ugh.
Rough. 11 of 65 potential snaps in week 5. He's not even part of the Jets offense anymore. It's become Breece Hall's backfield, who, by the way, Dave, I'll hand it to you, man. Breece looked very good. He was hitting full speed. He was making guys miss. He looks very much healthy. I still don't think he's at 100%, but he very much looks healthy and productive. We'll see. That Broncos litmus test can be a bit deceiving. We'll see how that continues going forward for the Jets. But either way,
I'll say the Broncos have kind of been a get right game for a lot of teams where they play the Broncos and then they start looking good afterwards. So, Broncos, good old slump buster.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see how that keeps going for the Jets. But yeah, regardless of whether the team gets better or not, I don't really know that I want any part of Dalvin Cook going forward.
I'll talk about Devin Singletary here as a drop. Dameon Pierce, man, he has just taken over the backfield, taken what was rightfully his. saw 100% of the carries in week 5 after growing that role in week 4 and seeing 75% of the carries in that game. So shout out to Jeff Bell, who kind of saw this coming and said, there is a changing of the guard happening here. They tried doing kind of a committee approach to start the season, and now they are just giving all of the workload to Dameon Pierce. Sounds crazy, but I think I'd rather, at this point, roster Mike Boone than Devin Singletary, because I don't even know if Devin Singletary is going to be like the next man up if Dameon Pierce gets injured. I think that he is just kind of a satellite back at this point. He's going to see 1 to 3 targets per game. He's going to get very little rushing work. I mean, Singletary is an undersized running back who doesn't really have any desirable athletics. We kind of got diluted by the touchdowns in Buffalo, but I don't think that he's really that good of a running back, and he's probably just going to be stuck in this role where he's seeing a couple touches a week. I think if there is an injury away guy to roster, it's probably Mike Boone, but really outside of Dameon Pierce, I don't know if there's anybody worth rostering on this Houston backfield.
And another name that we're familiar with, but it's just been so underwhelming this season, Damian Harris, running back for the Buffalo Bills. And I don't know how much this actually has to do with him or how much even has to do with James Cook, the starting running back, but Latavius Murray is out here taking the snaps from Damian Harris. He just continues to get work. He's getting goal line work. He's getting all of the opportunities that we thought Damian Harris was going to get. Even in a game where James Cook really didn't get used as much as we thought, Damian Harris was just an afterthought. I feel like I'm just copy pasting the same thing from Dalvin Cook earlier. 19 PPR points across 5 games and 11 of 65 snaps in week 5. He's not even being used by his own team. So I don't see where there's the value in him being on your fantasy roster, unless you're in very, very deep leagues and you need to roster a bunch of running backs or something like that, and he's handcuffed. But outside of an injury to James Cook, I'm not seeing the value to Damian Harris anymore. You're safe to go ahead and cut him.
It's probably it's probably time to have like a big picture conversation about the Buffalo Bills running offense as a whole, because like we everybody likes Zach Moss coming into the league, and he could never figure it out in Buffalo. Now he's on a new team and looking like an all-pro running back, and Damian Harris looked great during his time in New England. He can't get it done. James Cook is out here kind of turning nothing into something every single week, but he's been a little bit of a disappointment as well. It's really just, outside of Josh Allen, they can't get much going in the run game here in Buffalo. But I will give you a twofer. How about this?
Okay.
What we do here, under promise, over deliver. I told you I'm giving you a 1 cut. I'm going to give you 2, and they're on the same team, and they play the same position. Odell Beckham and Rashad Bateman. I think you cut them both at this point, man. I think we've just got to accept that Rashad Bateman just ain't it. Former first-round pick, dynasty darling. We've been waiting for it, but he has had double-digit PPR points just 8 times throughout his 3-year career. The most recent time he gave us a double-digit PPR outing was week 2 of last season. Now, obviously the context there, injuries. He's been injured a lot,
Right,
but he just can't seem to get it together. And then yesterday we saw wide open in the end zone from just a few yards out. I mean, Lamar Jackson put it on the money, and he just drops it. He just can't seem to figure it out in the NFL for whatever reason. And then Odell Beckham, like I said, giving you a 2 for here. He's been banged up all year, but when he's on the field, he just isn't drawing targets. I mean, he saw a season-high 4 targets yesterday. Woohoo! 5.9 PPR points. I mean, this offense runs
and he left the field too for a little bit with an injury once again. It seems like it's not just that he can't, he can't muster up the targets. It just doesn't seem like he can stay on the field long enough to make it matter.
Yeah. And did you see he got bodied by Joey Porter Jr. on that interception? And did you hear what Joey Porter Jr. said? He said, "Why don't you go back home and be a family man?" Just taking a shot at the age.
Oh, no.
Just brutal. Getting Odell Beckham, man, like a historically great wide receiver, getting talked down to by a rookie like that. I think that's just kind of it. I mean, this offense runs through Lamar Jackson, the running backs, Zay Flowers, and Mark Andrews. We had hopes that this would be like 3 fun wide receivers that would unleash Lamar Jackson. But yeah, Bateman and Beckham, I think you cut them both at this point.
I'm going to give you a surprising name. We've talked about him before on this show, and I really hate that I have to talk about him again. It's Jahan Dotson, wide receiver for the Washington Commanders. I'm beside myself, honestly, because Jahan Dotson, he is a very talented player. And for those of you who are going to try to go and crush us in the comments of go ahead and drop Jahan Dotson, I'm going to hold on to him. That's perfectly fine. I'm not telling you have to drop him. He's an incredibly talented player. And this is not about Jahan Dotson. This is about the Commanders offense. We have no idea what kind of Sam Howell we're going to get. He provides his own fantasy value, but not always for his wide receivers. And we're just like Dave mentioned, we're seeing that Logan Thomas is becoming kind of the de facto first target on this team.
Travis Kelce in this Eric Bieniemy offense, huh?
Don't say that.
Which that makes Sam Howell the Patrick Mahomes, right? Are these the comps we're making?
Do less.
No,
do less.
Absolutely.
Do less. Please do less. Stop that. But Jahan Dotson, it's been really disappointing, Dave. He's wide receiver 50 on the season. Mind you, that's including the players that have had bye weeks. Jahan Dotson has not had a bye week. He should have more of an advantage. So we're talking about a guy that might even be closer to wide receiver 60 at this point. He's been getting you 7 PPR points per game. He's second on the team in targets, but he's fourth in actual receptions. He has surpassed 4 receptions in a game just once, and that was week 1. I think that what happened is, a lot of us got excited, right, about the talent and how this player could explode. Very similarly, like what we all were saying about Brandon Ayuk. The difference is that offense in San Francisco has been able to put together drives and sustain drives and get enough volume for a good amount of the players and actually score touchdowns. The Commanders have not been able to do that. And I got this note from JJ Zacharyson. Jahan Dotson is yet to hit a 25% target share this season in a single game.
Oh.
He hasn't done it. In week 5, 10% target share. It's just a guy that he's not getting the volume. There was a lot of what you say, Dave, that touchdown cologne from last year that was really helping his production. It was something that was not sustainable. And I think we all acknowledged that it was not sustainable, but we figured that you'd trade in those touchdowns for some volume. And it just hasn't happened. So if you are in one of those shallow leagues where you don't need to roster a bunch of wide receivers, you're only starting 2 wide receivers, maybe it's a non-PPR league or even a half PPR league, Jahan Dotson has now become droppable.
Let me just throw another little dose of context here. We were saying drop Jahan Dotson, and just a few minutes ago I was saying pick up Curtis Samuel. We're not saying to drop Jahan Dotson for Curtis Samuel. Correct. It's kind of tough doing a show like this because we do have to make advice for everybody, whether you're in a 14-team league or a 10-team league. So these are 2 different types of leagues we're talking about. The leagues you're picking up and stashing Curtis Samuel in are your deeper leagues. The leagues that you're dropping Jahan Dotson in are your shallower leagues. So don't take this advice at face value and say, okay, well, Dave said I need to drop, or Alfredo said I need to drop Jahan Dotson, and Dave said I need to pick up Curtis Samuel. Those are for 2 different types of leagues that we're talking about here. But yeah, in your shallower leagues, I think you can cut bait with Jahan Dotson. Last guy I'll talk about is a cut candidate, Tyler Higbee. Just moved to being a complete afterthought in the offense with Cooper Kupp back in Los Angeles. Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua combined for 68% of the team's targets yesterday. I mean, it is very obvious that it is going to be these 2 commanding the targets, and you're hoping for a touchdown from Tutu or a touchdown from Higbee, but it's going to be really, really tough to determine when those are going to come. Higbee saw a season low 3 targets last year. And if you look at his splits, last week, season low 3 targets. And if you look at his splits last year, I mean, Higbee finished the season as tight end 6, but almost all of that production came in the second half of the year when Cooper Kupp wasn't playing. So right now, we've been talking about Higbee for weeks as kind of a must-start tight end, getting in the tight end 6, tight end 7, tight end 8 conversation. But now with Cooper Kupp back in the fold, he is no longer a must-start tight end. He's kind of in that tight end streamer churn. Without an injury to Kupp or Nacua, you're probably never going to feel confident starting Tyler Higbee.
And that stinks because the tight end landscape is so bad. And I'm about to give you another tight end that you can drop despite both of these guys being guys that were easily startable over the first few weeks here. And it's Hunter Henry, tight end for the New England Patriots. And I don't have to say much. If you watch that New England Patriots versus New Orleans Saints game this past week, you saw how bad that Patriots offense is. They are absolutely atrocious. Mac Jones has been really bad. Patriots offense, least amount of points in the NFL. Least amount of points. You need points. You need touchdown opportunities if you're a tight end. You need targets. If you go back and you look, Hunter Henry, first 2 weeks were phenomenal. Tight end 1 and tight end 2. Everything was buoyed by touchdown production, right? A touchdown each of those weeks. Since then, tight end 28, tight end 18. And this past week in week 5, 0 fantasy points, 2 targets, no receptions, nothing. A goose egg. You can't have that kind of player in your starting lineup, let alone your roster. I think you want to know there's going to be a player, even if it is like a Jake Ferguson type that's going to get the volume and maybe not have those same kind of boom weeks. I'd much rather have a guy that I know is not going to get me a 0 in my lineup. And now that possibility is always there. It lies dormant within this Patriots offense because we've seen that if they go up against an even relatively good defense, there could be goose eggs all around for these Patriots players. And that's just something I'm not willing to take the risk on. Now, before we move on, I want to let you guys know we're going to talk about streamers at the quarterback and tight end position, players that you can pick up from the waiver wire that should be readily available for you. But we're going to do that over on the audio version of this show. Okay. So to get the full version of this show, all you need to do is click the link in the description down below. You can check us out wherever you get your podcasts, on Apple, Spotify, wherever it may be, and you'll get to see the rest of this show. We do this every single week. This has been our Week 6 waivers, players to add, players to drop. Big thank you to Dave Kluge. We'll see you next time.